22 years ago, my parents, my brother, and I left Moscow. We flew into JFK International Airport in January of 1992. We had 4 suitcases of memories, some clothes, photographs, and $180. We also had a refugee status, and that is all we needed. That is all we had. This was the beginning of the future, a future bright and peaceful where belonging to a place is not unthinkable, where you can name your children anything you want without fear or apprehension of being discovered Armenian. My story is not unique. It's like so many other stories of Baku Armenians, of fellow Armenian refugees from Azerbaijan who fled their home in fear of their lives. Many of them are still in Armenia. Many live in Nagorno-Karabakh. Many live in Western Europe, and thousands of us live in the United States. What makes my family's particular story unique is that I kept a diary throughout the dark and painful years of my life, and upon coming to the United States, I had this overwhelming urge to take that diary and translate it for my future children. I was 14 years old. They will be American, I thought, and they would never speak or read Russian. They needed to know their roots, and they needed to never forget our sacrifices that we made to come to the United States. I was determined. I started writing by hand at the age of 14, translating my diary, and I finished my scribbles at the age of 16. I tucked the book, as I called it, away into my closet for the next 20 years, until I was persuaded to publish it by a Boston Armenian community when I was in law school. I was born an Armenian in Baku. I attended a prestigious school, was enrolled in ballet classes and volleyball practices. We were surrounded by hundreds of relatives. Together we went to the beach, celebrated birthdays, weddings, buried our family members, and saw each other weekly. My grandfather, Yegishe, my father's father, was a famous Armenian chef, and it seemed like the entire city respected him and knew his name. He came to Baku as a young man after World War II in search of work, which he found in the culinary industry. And by this move, he moved our family history into Azerbaijan. But his own history with Baku started much earlier. My grandfather was born in a legendary village of Khinzoresk. Many of you may have heard of it, in southern Armenia. When he was 2 years old in 1915, during the Armenian genocide, his parents perished, and his older sister moved the family east to Baku in Azerbaijan. On the train which rushed away from the family home in Khinzoresk, they met a little Armenian girl, barely a year old. She had a twin. Her family was starving. The little girl had a burn scar on her back, and the family couldn't feed both children. They were quietly and painfully conspiring to throw the damaged, as they called the twin, off the train. My grandfather's sister couldn't listen to it any longer, and she interrupted this conversation. She offered to take the little girl and adopted her. This little girl later became my grandfather's sister, Aunt Maria, and she lived into her 90s. The family settled in Baku. Hundreds of thousands of Armenians lived there for generations and felt safe for the moment. But in 1918, the ethnic cleansing of Armenian genocide was replicated in Baku by the Turcotte Tatar people, later named Azerbaijanis. Tens of thousands of Baku Armenians were slaughtered, the entire population attacked in many ways and robbed in every way. Once again, 3 years later, Yegishe's family was on the move, fleeing the atrocities. They escaped the killings of Armenians in Baku, this time by boat. The Russian boats were smuggling Armenian families across the Caspian to Turkmenistan. Many of my family members still live there. But after several years there, my grandfather and his family went back across Caspian to Yerevan. This was when the Soviet Union began to take shape in the 1920s. After the war, In 1945, my grandfather came back to Baku, however. He felt that the Soviet regime reassured that there was safety, and my grandfather moved back for work. Baku was a very industrial city, and there was a lot more work than there was in Yerevan. My parents were born there, my cousins and my brother were born there. Hundreds of my relatives called Baku home. But despite this peace, I felt that Armenians who love Baku knew their place. When I was born, my parents decided against naming me Anush, after both of my great-grandmothers, and picked a very neutral international version of the name and named me Anna. Yegishe knew of the horrors that may exist in Azerbaijan against Armenians, and he Russified the name, taking the Armenian ending yan and Russified it to sound more Russian. So we were no longer Astvatsaturian. We were Astvatsaturov and Astvatsaturova. Little did he know it was that this change would save us when the storm of hatred against Armenians ignited again in 1988, 10 years after he passed away. As the Soviet Union began its collapse, the republics of the Union began to assert their independence. The first such movement was started by Nagorno-Karabakh, the Armenian land that was given to Azerbaijan by Stalin. This land held a referendum. The people, majority Armenians, held a referendum to join Armenia, some 70 years after being under artificial Azerbaijani rule. This was why in February of 1988, the life as we knew it for my family and hundreds of our friends ceased to exist. February 27th through March 1st of 1988 marked the Sumgait pogroms. The Azerbaijanis became enraged to lose the region, taking their hatred out on the Armenian population of Azerbaijan. The government began propaganda of hatred to ignite the everyday citizens against their neighbors. First, it was the city of Sumgait, then in November of 1988, Kirovabad, and then Baku. Thugs stormed our streets and attacked us for simply being Armenian. My school was constantly raided, the rioters looking for Armenian students. Armenian families were spread out across Baku, as was planned since the 1970s, when Armenian neighborhoods were dismantled and Armenian families were moved away from each other, scattered away across the city. This is why when a family of Armenians was attacked, sometimes there was no one there to defend them. My neighborhood was in the center of violent demonstrations, and we were living in the dark with windows shut, waiting out the storm. My father locked the doors and waited with knives in his hands to protect us. We were reliving the nightmare my grandfather endured exactly 70 years later. Not only was I confused as a child, watching the sudden surge of violence erupt around us, but my parents were confused as well. This cannot be happening in this day and age, my mom always said. My grandmother, a very wise Russian woman, told me to start keeping a diary, because things like this don't happen every day, Anna, and you must never forget. This diary is this book. My parents started looking at options, even though my mom was still in denial that this was happening in Baku. Russia was not an option because we couldn't find a place to live and work there. Armenia was not an option because it was difficult to find a place to live there as well. For almost 2 years, we were in a state of fear and shock in Baku, hoping for things to calm down. Sometimes the Soviet forces arrived during the unrest and things became quiet with tanks on our streets. But they were only there to make sure the Azerbaijanis knew who was in control, Moscow, and not to protect us, as many of the soldiers told us when we asked them to protect us. They were told not to interfere, even though we brought them food. The months spent surrounded by Soviet tanks never offered any protection or security. We never knew when we could be attacked and when the riots would resume. When thousands of Armenians died during the 1988 earthquake in Armenia, Armenians of Baku received festive cards of congratulations from random Azerbaijani citizens congratulating them on deaths of Armenians, and there were some celebrations as well. Going to school became terrifying. My face and my name was terrifying. My father told me to keep my head low when walking down the street, and if I was ever asked for my nationality, to tell them that I was Greek. Even now, as a grown adult, an American citizen living in safety, when I come across Azerbaijani speech for the very first time in the United States, in Washington, D.C., my instant reaction was to hide my face down and to the left. And security that we thought we had in our life disappeared. And I'll read a little from the book. We're gathered in my grandmother's apartment, all of us. Mama, Papa, Misha, Grandma, and me. We have locked the doors from the inside and sit waiting with all the windows closed and shuttered. We turn the lights off. Papa tells Misha and me to speak in whispers. Papa takes all the knives out of the kitchen drawers and sets them in a pile in front of him at the dining room table, prepared for the worst. He keeps saying, "If they break in, I will take a few of them with me to the other world." We're afraid to talk out loud. We whisper if we have to, but barely. Mama is holding Misha on her lap on the sofa, her face buried in the blonde curls, and Grandma is sitting on the chair looking at her wrinkly hands, which rest on her old-fashioned cotton dress. Through the unfortunate cracks in the blinds, we see people rushing down the street with green flags. There are so many of them, their shoulders brush against the walls of our building. We see a few black flags, which mean death and vengeance, handmade in a hurry. The demonstrators run and rush against and past our building. They're shouting, chanting, and screaming in Azeri. As I sneak a look in the crack in the shutters, I see a man in a black coat. He's in the front of the crowd, walking backwards, shouting something. From that distance, we cannot understand what he's saying, though his voice is loud and he addresses the crowd in Azeri. It seems that he is trying to stop them, but they only yell louder and rush forth, almost as if to tell the man in black that they will not listen to him. Surely enough, they shove him to the side, and a few demonstrators enter the patio of the apartment building right next to ours. They yell for Armenians to come out. This building is well known for housing Armenians who have lived there for several generations. A few of them were mixed families, Azeris, Russian, and Armenian. Papa shoves me away from the window. The demonstrators yell and scream. When no one lets them in, they start hurling rocks at the windows. We hear crashing and muffled commotion and yelling. Suddenly, they appear back in the street and rush ahead toward the Lenin Square, looking for excitement elsewhere. They appear to miss our building. It is too close to the railroad and is out of sight. The gates to the patio are shielded by bushes and trees. Later, we learned that Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians are trying to secede from Azerbaijan and rejoin Armenia. This was no longer our home. This was a place we had to flee like hundreds of thousands of our other Armenian citizens of Azerbaijan. Some left bruised, beaten with nothing in the middle of the night in their nightgowns, boarding ships to nowhere. Others leaving hurriedly to distant places away from everything they knew and everyone they loved. We didn't just lose our belongings, our homes, and our security. Many of us lost their lives. The graves of my grandparents in Baku are no longer there because they were demolished, as were all of the Armenian cemeteries in Azerbaijan. The Armenian church in the center of Baku, the church I treasured visiting as a child, was set ablaze. I've witnessed violence and intolerance against Armenians with my own eyes and with my own body, the body of a child, threatened and attacked by an angry Azerbaijani neighbor. Summer welcomed us into its languid world. The days were hot. The ice cream wagon showed up in the neighborhood more frequently now. We remained indoors most of the time, coming out only in the evenings. The riots and the anti-Armenian demonstrations continued, but I still dreamed of going to the beach after everything calmed down. It remained a dream. On one occasion, demonstrators broke into our patio. We hid inside, and Papa armed himself with knives and sticks. Tears no longer came. I was used to this routine now. As we learned afterwards, our Azeri neighbor, Rahiba, had informed the thugs that Armenians lived in the building, instigating the violence. As the crowd turned aggressive, armed teenagers busted through the gate of the patio. But Anagis, the twins' mother, and her husband confronted them just in time, swearing by Allah and their prophet that Armenians had never lived there. Reluctant and disappointed, the angry mob finally left. No words could describe our gratitude. Our Azeri neighbor saved our lives, while the other Azeri neighbor wanted us dead. I did not talk to the twins, although I wanted to express my feelings of gratitude. I simply couldn't walk up and talk to them. A feeling of wounded pride stood in the way. Besides, I suspected I didn't believe they would do what their parents did. This new wave of riots that hit so close to home finally made my mama agree with Papa. The bitter realization hit her suddenly and she was in shock. Papa, feeling relief, calmly suggested that Mama, Misha, and I go to Armenia for a few weeks and look around to see if we could live there. The news excited me. Finally, something was happening. I thought Papa was going to come with us, but he said he could not quit his job yet. We remained in Baku during the months of June and July. Mama had reserved the plane tickets for the month of August. She described to us the fear that filled her heart and the looks of strangers when she asked for our tickets at the Aeroflot building. Fortunately, no one made an issue of the fact that she was purchasing tickets to Armenia. I waited impatiently for the day we fly to Armenia. Even now, as I was about to go there, it was odd for me to think of Armenia as a real place and not as a mythical, collectively imagined and cherished idea. We fled Baku, as did over 300,000 Armenians from Azerbaijan. The only place that we could go was Yerevan. We had relatives there. Armenia was a magical place for me, a place my family often described in stories of beautiful churches and mountains and music and delicious fruit. One of the very first places we visited was Holich Medin, and we're personally blessed by Armenian Catholicos Vazgen II. We were comforted by this spiritual experience at this horrific time in our lives. But Armenia was far from an ideal place with its recent problems. The 1988 earthquake that demolished major cities created floods of refugees that came to Yerevan. Blockade from all directions cut off Armenia from fuel and so many provisions needed for the everyday survival of the people. While everyone suffered, Baku Armenians and the earthquake victims were in the worst shape. Many of our Baku family and friends lived in theaters, old prisons, abandoned buildings, and empty factories. Many Baku Armenians were not wanted there. My family and I were lucky. We lived in a tiny cold stone cellar of a relative's house and made it our home for 2.5 years. It had no running water, no heat, it had nothing. The floors and walls were rotting and we had nowhere to go, but at least we had relatives. The changes that were enveloping the entire Soviet Union were colossal. Life in the rotting dungeon we called a home in Yerevan was unbearable, with no future in sight, and the light at the end of the tunnel was the United States of America. Now, 22 years later, the entire experience, along with the wisdom and strength I've gained from it, makes a lot of sense. My family and I encompassed the entire trajectory of a glimpse of the history of my people. Our long, painful past paints just how united we are, but we don't really know it. In the course of my family's 100-year history, the Sunni Armenians of Hınzăresc become Baku Armenians. And then those same Baku Armenians become the Western diaspora Armenians. Once in the United States, we settled in North Dakota, a very cold, cold state. We knew no one in the United States. We knew no one in that state. No one there knew of Armenians, our history, or culture. Some doubted that we were even Christian or knew how to use a spoon. There were no Armenian communities in that state aside from a handful of refugee families. My parents worked tirelessly right away as we settled and began to understand the difficult life in the United States. I finished university and law school and started my family. My diary, in the book that I wrote between the ages of 14 and 16, was always in the back of my mind. I knew of its importance to my family, but I didn't realize its value to the people of Armenia and the Armenian diaspora. Once my kids were born, Armen and Evangeline, I began to seriously consider publishing the diary after discussing it with my family and friends and a wider Armenian community. And just as a note, I named my son Armen because I could, because I didn't have to hide his name. I was reluctant to publish it. It was a very intimate insight into my life as a child living in Baku and as a child refugee. In the book, I go into detail about my thoughts, emotion, and family dynamics. I did not want to reveal these things to the world, scary world around me. But that, I was told, is what makes the book unique. It's written by a child without any sophistication in the spheres of politics or international law. It doesn't have an agenda or an ulterior motive. It's just my voice at 10 and 12 and 13 and a half, talking about ethnic cleansing acts against Armenian people. And in 2012, I called the book as a silly joke. My entire childhood and early adulthood actually became a book. Once it was published, I thought I will do only several book presentations, and then it will be in some library, then maybe someday someone will read. And I thought that I could go back to my private life. I had no idea of the interest the words I wrote in Baku as a 10-year-old child would, in a tiny basement in Kanaker in 1991, would be to the communities of Armenians and also non-Armenians across the United States and the world. I was invited to speak to a congressional audience on Capitol Hill and across Armenian communities worldwide. My book is being taught in curriculums across the United States in several universities and high schools, both in genocide studies and English classes. But speaking about the past wasn't enough, and doing these multiple events began to trigger my activist spirit. Being a mother made me think not only of my children, but the children of Artsakh and children of Armenia. I was inspired by the state of Rhode Island and Massachusetts for passing resolutions supporting the independence of Nagorno-Karabakh, and I thought to myself, why not my state of Maine? My husband and I put our minds together and found the right representative in our state legislature. This representative was intelligent, thoughtful, and brave, and he knew his history. Our timing was right. A few weeks later, the resolution supporting Nagorno-Karabakh's independence was passed unanimously in the Maine House of Representatives. Once this victory was achieved, I've traveled to various states speaking not only about my book and my life, but also about the plight of people of Artsakh. The stories of Baku Armenians began inspiring people, just as I was inspired, to pass pro-Armenian resolutions and to kill dishonest anti-Armenian resolutions put forth by the government of Azerbaijan. What I found interesting is that the Baku Armenian community, somewhat isolated from the larger Armenian diaspora in the United States, is alive and well, both as a community and individually as successful families. They are becoming leaders in business, law, and other industries. Their families are strong, and they have a voice. And when Azerbaijani resolutions come to the states, they are inspired to act. They call their representatives, they educate their congressmen, they call their friends and family to do the same. Just this year, South Dakota Baku Armenians and Tennessee Baku Armenians demolished any chance of passing an anti-Armenian resolutions put forth by the government of Azerbaijan. How dare you, they say, especially the South Dakota Armenians, somewhat isolated in South Dakota. How dare you kill us, take away our homes and our entire lives, and they come to the United States, our home, and spread lies about us. This is our home. And they are everywhere. Anywhere Azerbaijani government goes to spread lies about Armenians, thanks to their own ethnic cleansing acts, they will find a Baku Armenian family somewhere. But I think that the larger diaspora needs to engage these families a little more. I hope this is happening across the world. I begin to see that it's happening in the United States. I recently was invited to speak in Western Europe and at the European Parliament in Brussels. It puts historical things into perspective for people in leadership. We're not just 400,000 people in a textbook. We're real and we remember, and now we are speaking out. But we need to be united in our message to the world. What I learned these past 2 years after publishing my book is that speaking of Armenian unity between Armenians is a very tiresome and cliche, but it's also a very correct statement. When their enemy kills an Armenian to wipe us off the face of the earth, they don't ask, do you speak Armenian? Are you born in Armenia? Are you born outside of Armenia? They don't really care. They just want us dead. By speaking out about the most painful thing in my life, my childhood, I hope to bring this message of unity to communities across the world. I hope I'm doing enough on my end because the fight still continues in Nagorno-Karabakh, the only Armenian land that the Armenians ever took back in our long history. Azerbaijan has raised a generation of Armenian haters. As we speak, Armenians in Karabakh are dying on the border due to Azerbaijani aggression and hatred toward our people. Armenians are targeted as enemies by Azerbaijani government and its president, any Armenian. Armenian children in Nagorno-Karabakh and in Armenia and everywhere in the world deserve to live their lives in peace without fearing death and hiding in the dark, just as I did in Baku, just as many, many children did in Artsakh. We continue bravely into this uncertain future, but not as victims, only as very strong survivors who still dance and laugh at the Republic Square, in the streets of Stepanakert and around the world. We honor our past and we always look to the future. Thank you so much.